Hello and welcome back. Let's get started with our metadata management application using low-code technologies. Let's go. Just a reminder, we have two use cases and today's focus is how do we take this Excel spreadsheet and import it into Azure SQL using Azure Data Factory. And yes, the focus of today's video or today's session is Azure Data Factory. The assumption is that the Excel spreadsheet in SharePoint has been moved to Azure storage account using Power Automate Flow. So the focus is Azure Data Factory. Let's keep going. Before we dive into actual hands-on work, I want to go over the agenda. I want to talk about some guidelines and recommendations. Recommend you the number of environments and deployment model you need. How to make your life easy by having a consistent naming standards, and if you name them correctly you can reuse those objects across your projects. I want to recommend that you put your user ID passwords in Azure Key Vault. Then we go into implementation details where we're actually creating pipelines and activities. I'll show you tips and tricks of how to make XLSM work. Then we'll go into some error handling, adding a trigger, unit tests, and monitor. Then we'll summarize it with lessons learned, basically do's and don'ts. So the first topic is environments and deployment. My recommendation is that you at least have dev, test, and production environments. Some shops may decide that you need additional environments such as UAT, staging, hotfix environments, but these three are at least at the minimum, even if you're a one-man show. And also allow your manual edits to only happen in dev environment. Then from then onwards, when you deploy to test and production, let the flow go through the repository using ARM templates. Below is an example flow. Next topic is naming standards. So this is prerequisite before you enable your environments for edit. And just keep in mind there is no perfect naming standard, but having a consistent way of naming your activities, link services, pipelines will save you a ton of time down the road. And I would strongly recommend that you have policies in place where if the developer is submitting a pull request without following these naming standards, the pull request will be rejected. Let's take a look at the high level what we'll be doing for next few minutes. We'll create a single pipeline. We'll create a linked services that points to Azure Blob Storage. We'll create a linked service that points to Azure SQL. We'll create a source data set and destination data set, then multiple activities. For this exercise, we'll assume that we're using existing Azure Blob Storage and Azure SQL. So with every Azure Data Factory pipeline, I start with the linked services. So we'll create an Azure Key Vault linked service, and we'll use this Azure Key Vault linked service in Azure Blob Storage and Azure SQL Database linked services. And if you design this correctly, you can use these three linked services for your other projects and pipelines. It's pretty straightforward. All you do is you click on New, you fill in some information such as name and connection string, then you test and it's ready to be used for your pipeline. One thing I should mention is that you need to go into your Azure Key Vault and add the Azure Data Factory principal ID into the access policy, and that way you will allow the Azure Data Factory to access your Azure Key Vault. To save some time, I've gone ahead and created the pipeline with the activities. So I'll just highlight things that I think matter most and things that you might forget over time. So real quick, first step is getting metadata about files that are in the Blob Storage account, filter them only to XLSM files, and for each XLSM file that's in the Azure Blob Storage, I import into Azure SQL account, and if it's successful, I create a login tree that says okay, success. If it fails, I trigger a store procedure that says, okay, something went wrong. Okay. Now, in the first step, in get metadata, what I think matters most is when you're setting up your data source, just make sure that you're not specifying the file name, and when you're asked to enter the sheet name, you manually enter that. Then make sure this edit button is clicked, and you run the debug. Just make sure the files are coming along. At this point, you should get all the files and not just filtered to XLSM. Now, there's some additional things you can do. You don't have to do this. Based on your requirement, you can filter them to get only files that were uploaded within the last 90 minutes. Then there's some additional filters you can apply. This is where I'm saying, okay, only give me the XLSM files. Then for each XLSM file that's in the Azure storage account, I'm setting up my source. What matters here is I pick this wildcard file path, and I set dynamic content to get each file name while it's iterating. Then in the sync, I am setting up my store procedure. Just keep in mind the service here is from what we created earlier in this session. Once the store procedure is picked, you can import parameters. Let's quickly take a look at the store procedure and related parameters. This on the top is the table. This is corresponding user defined type table that works with this table. And the store procedure takes two parameters. One is the user defined type that I just created, and additional parameter that says, okay, what's the file name. Now the import is pretty straightforward. I insert into the table and select everything from incoming type. Okay. Now once you pick this store procedure and say import parameters, it's automatically going to import the type. If your type doesn't start, or it's not in the DBO schema, then you need to specify the schema. In this case, since it's DBO, it's optional, but I put it there just so you know if the schema is not DBO, you need to enter it. Then the file name, the source file name is dynamic again here. You can add the dynamic content through this dynamic content assister. Then once you go to the mapping tab, things will be automatically populated. If they're not, go ahead and click on import schema and supply a sample file name and click OK. While you do that, it's going to import. And if you've named the tables, table column names and the spreadsheet column names the same, it's automatically going to map it for you. And if you haven't, then you need to manually map them. Okay. And the last step here is if this import is successful, I trigger a store procedure that says, okay, things were imported successfully. And if it was not successful, then I trigger a store procedure that says something failed. Then you can also add some dynamic content where you're getting the error message itself. Okay. So this concludes the import process end to end. Okay. Creating a trigger and associating to a pipeline is very straightforward. The first step is you author a trigger. And I'm going to switch to something that I've created earlier. It's pretty simple. You enter some meaningful name, you fill in the required information here, and at the end you specify when the blob or file is created. Once you've done with this, then you go into your pipeline, and from the triggers you pick the newly created trigger, or you assign this trigger to your pipeline. Before I go into lessons learned, I quickly want to show you where you can monitor your pipeline activities. So within the monitor workspace, there is a pipeline runs tab and triggers runs tab, and within the pipeline runs there's triggered and debug. Debug is things that you were running while you were creating your pipeline. The triggered ones, you can look into what failed, what succeeded, and as well as look at if there was an error, look at the errors and the error logs. Here are a few of the lessons learned that I've captured while I was working on this project. I hope you find it useful, and thank you for watching.